Director of Marketing and Communications in the Division of Development and Alumni Relations, and I'm your moderator for today's webinar. Before we begin, let's take a moment to ensure that everyone is ready and familiar with the presentation tools. All participants in today's webinar have joined in mute mode and cannot be heard during the presentation. However, we absolutely encourage participation. To submit your questions at any time, please enter them in the chat box. The chat box can be opened by clicking on the chat icon at the right of your Livestorm window. We will make every effort to address all your comments and questions throughout the webinar. You are joining today's webinar using broadcast audio. If for any reason you wish to dial in by phone, dial-in information is provided in the chat box. Live captioning is also being provided during the webinar, and you can find that link to access that in the chat box as well. Note that today's webinar will be recorded and made available, complete with captions, in approximately 1 week following today's event. All participants will receive an email with the link to the recording. If you have any technical questions, please feel free to type those into the chat box as well, and we will do our best to get you the appropriate answers. And with that, let's get started. Today's webinar is Wine, Thinking, Drinking, and Anthropology. Our distinguished guest presenter is Robert Ulin, professor in RIT's Department of Sociology and Anthropology in the College of Liberal Arts. Dr. Ulin served for 2 years as Dean of the College of Liberal Arts after coming to RIT from his post as Chair of Anthropology at Western Michigan University. He is well known for his work in, I'm sorry, you'll have to help me with this,
hermeneutics.
Hermeneutics, thank you. Hermeneutics, critical thinking, and historical anthropology. He is here today in his other noted role, that of recognized expert in wine and culture. Dr. Ulin is the author of the book Vintages and Traditions, a study of the history of regional wine cooperatives in Southwest France. He has also authored numerous articles on the anthropology of wine. He received Gourmand International's runner-up prize for 2014's Best Book in the World in the category of Writing About Drink for his book Wine and Culture from Vineyard to Glass, which was co-written with Rachel E. Black. Dr. Ulin holds a BA from Whittier College and an MA and PhD from the New School for Social Research. Dr. Ulin assures me that he loves to take questions, so please feel free to enter those into the chat box, and we will address those as we move along. Dr. Ulin, our audience is yours.
Thank you very much, Lydia. And let me just take a moment to welcome all of you out there. It's a pleasure for me to have the opportunity to speak to alumni. As a former dean, I can assure you that alumni are one of the most important foundations that we have here at RIT. So checking in here is an important way to keep in contact with the university. I want to take a moment or two to talk first as an anthropologist and how an anthropologist ever manages to fall upon a topic such as wine. Anthropologists are best known for studying cultures around the world, for taking themselves to remote parts of the world, engaging with indigenous peoples and writing about that. However, for me, wine is a sort of index. That is, I'm not going to be talking to you as an enologist, someone who is an expert in the making of wine, as a biochemist, or even for that matter, as a marketer. But wine tells us a lot about history, social relationships, and culture. For example, wine tends to be a commodity that is highly gendered. So if we go to wineries around the world, we find that the leading roles are often assumed by men. Wine is also something that tells us a great deal about social class. As we know, there are enormous differences between a bottle of wine that's $8.99 and one that can be $800. So I use wine not so much to talk about the product itself, but to use the product to really open up a range of very important social, cultural, and political issues. I began doing research many years ago, actually in the early 1980s, working with small-scale wine growers who were members of wine cooperatives. There were several reasons for that. One, basically wine cooperatives require tremendous amounts of cooperation among the various members. And for somebody who was raised and educated in the midst of the 1960s and 1970s, I was very much fascinated by the unrealized potentials of what people working together could accomplish. Secondly, and this is really more of a strategy on my part. Yes, you can go to the famous chateaus in France. You can spend your time studying them, the people who own them, who work there, who make the wine. But that does not really give you a picture of French wine in its totality. Rather, what I came to discover is that although French wine cooperatives produce roughly 40% of the wine produced in France, and there are roughly 650 cooperatives altogether. If you look at the famous tomes, books written about the history of French wine, there is virtually nothing about wine cooperatives. And for an anthropologist curious about things which are left at the periphery of history, I thought this would be a great place to start. Moreover, I thought, why not learn something about elite French wines by starting with growers who, in fact, are often overlooked in those accounts written historically and in the popular press about wine. This gives you a very basic map of French wine growing regions for those of you who are not familiar. And if you will allow me, my research was conducted in this general area. You can see Bordeaux, and also the region directly to the east, Dordogne. And basically, the cooperatives that I studied, many of them were founded in the 1930s. They were created as a result of trying to create opportunities for small growers who had holdings that were not really regarded as plentiful, and to give cooperative growers an opportunity to escape some of the exploitation that they had been subject to on the part of merchants. What typically would happen is merchants on an annual basis would make their circuit through the southwest of France, and they would offer variable prices for the grapes that they would purchase from the growers. The growers themselves had no control over the process. What they came to realize is that if they would band together, they were in a much more strategic position to deal with merchants, middlemen, who had benefited at the expense of the growers. The earliest wine cooperatives were created in France in the early part of the 20th century in an area known as Languedoc, which is in the south. These earliest cooperatives were quite radical in nature. And what I mean by radical in nature is that the cooperatives collectivized the land. That is, ownership of land was abandoned and given over to the cooperative so that they could advance their enterprise in a more coordinated fashion. Well, this was short-lived. Private property was very much valued. And the cooperatives that I studied, founded in the early 30s in Dordogne, very much believed in the principle of private ownership of vineyards. What really became collective was the opportunity to bring grapes to the cooperative and to have them vinified collectively. And there are lots of benefits in doing that. However, mixing together the grapes that could come from 300 different properties did not stand very well with those who would judge the wines, who would write about them. They were often concerned that this was not a good way to ensure the quality. And so consequently, many cooperatives ended up having a sort of a lesser reputation compared to the very elite and large wine estates that would take all of their grapes from a similar property. And this is really where the issue of climate and soil becomes important. Every time I would have a conversation with someone from a cooperative in the Dordogne, they would almost always respond by asking me, what was I doing there when the famous and celebrated wines of the Southwest were found in proximity to Bordeaux? And I would explain to them, well, I wasn't there to evaluate their wines. I was there to understand something about family histories, how people managed to work in the vineyards, the problems and the issues they faced, why it is that their reputations were lesser than those of elite wines. These sorts of issues were of paramount interest to me as an anthropologist. However, hidden in all of this conversation was the assumption that if you did go to Bordeaux and you began to look concretely at their climate and the quality of their soils, it was simply assumed that the soil was better in the Bordeaux region than in fact it was in the interior. So as a person who has a pretty critical sensibility, I wondered, is this really true? And how would we come to know this? There's a very famous book called Terroir, and it is a book that seeks to evaluate how we can come to know whether or not soil is the key factor in determining the quality of grapes. Everybody has always known, and this I would not dispute, that older vines have lesser yields, and generally if you have lesser yields, you're going to get better quality wine. The question is, how can you really determine if the soil is actually better? Well, some people had the idea that you could use seismic technology, which is really widely used in the oil industry. And this has to do with the ability to send sound waves deep into the soil and to read the geology of the bedrock and various geological formations that would underlie any given vineyard. I mean, you simply cannot dig too deeply around vine plants because the potential is you're going to do harm. And what was discovered is that, in fact, there are better soil conditions in certain areas where notable wines are produced than in other areas. But what actually came to be known is that even within a single elite property, there were remarkable differences from one part of the property to the next. I don't know if you can see the book title, Terroir, that closely, but the author is James Wilson, and he has, of course, become very renowned with the work that he has done around climate and soil. My question had to do, has this always historically been the case? Is it the case that the wines produced in the immediate vicinity of Bordeaux have had in sort of an ageless superior reputation to those of cooperatives that I initially studied in the Dordogne. Well, what I came to discover is that back in the 12th century in the southwest of France, some of the most renowned areas around Bordeaux didn't cultivate vineyards at all. In fact, the Medoc, which is just north of Bordeaux, in which has been famous for a very long time, was an area best known for boar hunting on the part of the aristocracy. They would get on their horses, have their dogs, and they would hunt boars. The interior part, the area today that has a lesser reputation than that of Bordeaux, in fact, was known for making wines that were really good. So the obvious question is, how is it that an area that was renowned in the 12th century for its wine today has a reputation quite subordinate to the wines that are produced in Bordeaux? Well, a lot of that would change with the English occupation. And I'm just going to jump forward here and introduce some characters. One is Eleanor of Aquitaine. And as you can see from the dates on the slide, she was married to King Louis of France. She was known to be a very strong-willed woman, very much wanted to get her own way, and had continual conflict with her husband. Well, she divorced him and ended up marrying King Henry of England. And King Henry had been the Duke of Normandy and the Aquitaine, and eventually became King of England from 1154 to 1189. Well, why is this important? Well, you have Eleanor of Aquitaine suddenly married to the King of England. And the King of England, because of his connections to the southwest of France, used his resources to occupy the southwest of France. Occupations are never easy things to endure. And what happened is that Henry had the somewhat brilliant idea that rather than using force, he would use persuasion. So what he did is he approached the town councilors. These are the people that were responsible for the political management of the city of Bordeaux. And he said, let's strike a deal. And what he offered was the fact that the wines that were grown immediately in the vicinity of Bordeaux, that is in proximity to Bordeaux, he would give them access, earlier access to the port of Bordeaux than wines that came from the interior. So that was very favorable. Secondly, wines were subject to taxation. And so what he decided is that we would tax interior wines at a much more favorable rate than those who came from the interior. Well, the town councilors thought this was a really good idea. And what it did is it stimulated the planting of vineyards in areas of proximity to Bordeaux. So the area that I mentioned in Medoc, which today is world renowned, they cut down the forests and they began to plant vineyards. And of course, this does not happen overnight. It's a process that takes several hundred years. And as Bordeaux grew as a principal wine growing region, much of the wine that was produced there, of course, was exported to England. And as Bordeaux became a very favorable marketing center with increasing acreage that was devoted to the growing of wine, well, it began to have a superordinate reputation over those wines which are grown in the interior. Well, what does that mean? Does it mean that James Wilson is wrong? No, he's not. I mean, there's no doubt that anyone who pays attention to environmental conditions would support the argument that certainly the climate in the southwest of France, and especially around Bordeaux, is very suitable to wine growing. Secondly, we have evidence today that, in fact, the soils likewise are very favorable. But I've made quite a reputation with the argument that looking at history becomes an important supplemental feature for trying to understand why one region, the interior, which had a superior reputation to Bordeaux over a period, and this is a long period, begins to decline in importance. So my argument has been, yes, pay attention to climate and soil, but it's likewise equally important to understand that there are historical factors and changing historical factors that can well explain the decline and the ascendancy of certain wine regions.
Dr. Ulin, we do have a question from Christopher. He asks if you know what measurement of the soil specifically determined meaningful differences to winemaking.
Well, the aspects of the soil had to do with what they call sous-sol, or the deep soil. So I don't recall all the biochemistry of the soil, other than to say that there's a certain amount of limestone, it's chalky, there are nutrients that are not necessarily ascertainable at the surface that can be found much deeper because the roots go down several meters. And these are the factors that prior to James Wilson's research really were never known. So I hope that answers your question in part, because it's never been my point of view that soil isn't important. But now that we can use seismic technology and really sound waves do absolutely no damage to those roots, we can attempt to look at bedrock at some considerable depth. The other historical moment in French history, and there are numerous others, so I'm really being quite selective here, has to do with Napoleon III. And those of you familiar with French history may know that at the end of the 19th century, even though there was an entity called France, it was still very regionally fragmented. So, for example, in some of the villages in the southwest of France where I did my work, in the 19th century, none of the small growers, the peasants, the small-scale farmers spoke French. They spoke a patois. And it would often be the elites in the villages, the village priest, who would in fact translate for the growers any of the edicts or political initiatives that were coming down from Paris. So Napoleon, a great military genius, but also, I think, a politically adept leader, was heavily invested in creating a stronger sense of the French nation state. And he had the ideal, why don't we have what's called a universal exposition? And the universal expositions were in fact precursors to what we know today as world fairs. That is, countries would come forward and present cultural artifacts, cultural accomplishments that, in a sense, could come to stand for the nation itself, not only as representative of what already existed, but in the formative sense of helping to create a stronger sense of French national culture as it emerged. So Napoleon approached some of the elites in the Bordeaux region and asked them to come forward with a classification of their wines. And of course, that classification is famous. It's the 1855 classification of Bordeaux wines. It's divided into 5 different categories based upon first being the most elite to 5th, which are highly respectable. And interestingly enough, it's a classification that has changed with very little modification right up to the modern day. So you want to ask, where does the reputation of wines emerge from? They not only emerge from the fact that people like the taste of various given wines, but they emerge from a political history that attempts to advance certain wines from a particular region towards the end of not only being good wines, but where these wines come to stand for the French nation itself. And if you think about smaller scale growers, some of the proprietors who had minimal resources available to themselves, it's very hard to stack up against that kind of a history that favors really the aristocracy that were involved in French wine growing. I should say, by the way, I encourage you to post some questions for me. I'm still actively teaching at RIT, and I respond well to questions that some of you may have. And if you look at some of these buildings, for example, which are really the home estate houses that you find on some of Bordeaux's famous estates, you see that they have a commanding presence. This is, of course, Chateau Margaux, one of the very famous French wineries in the Southwest. And it almost has something that can approach what we would call Federalist architecture, if you see the columns which are in the front. Another one that is well known is Chateau Lafite Rothschild. Of course, you know that the Rothschild family is a banking family in France that became heavily invested in the wine business. And as you can see from this particular chateau, which is located in the Medoc, it really is a small scale representation of the very large and famous chateaus that can be found in the Loire Valley south of the city of Paris. And many of those chateaus in the Loire Valley ended up being summer retreats for the king and queen. And the reason that I'm pointing to this is not only the importance of that 1855 classification and the fact that wines listed there became iconic of the French nation state, but it is also became a way symbolically of associating French wines with the aristocracy. I mean, we're talking about a period after the French Revolution, where in fact France, celebrated the end of rule by kings and birthright. Yet, oddly enough, the aristocracy, symbolically speaking, ends up playing an extremely important role in terms of establishing that contact between the well-lived life and the consumption of wine. The use of sort of these chateau-like buildings isn't something that only was capitalized on by elite vineyards in the southwest of France. Here we have Chateau de Monboeuf, which is owned by the Monboeuf Cooperative. And you may ask, cooperative like Monboeuf, why would they purchase a chateau? Well, for one thing, it's iconic. It comes like the famous chateaus I just showed you as a way of associating wines which are not regarded as superior or elite with a life of the aristocracy, with the life of elites. It also, in terms of tourism, becomes an excellent way to bring people who, in fact, might not otherwise come and visit a cooperative to the cooperative. So, in fact, they can have a tour of the chateau, they can taste the wines, they can learn a little bit about its connections to the local area, its culture, its food, the whole entourage, which is really important in terms of tourism. Here, I switch gears slightly in terms of talking about the mechanization of the vineyards. This is an issue of really rather considerable controversy right up to the present day. Here we see a tractor which is constructed in a certain way that it passes over the top of the rows of vines so as not to disturb them. They use this for spraying. During the harvest, these type of tractors have a device that will shake the vines so that the grapes will fall onto a conveyor belt and back into wagons, which are pulled along behind the tractor. This is something quite common among the cooperatives, but really not utilized by the elite vineyards. The elite vineyards in the southwest of France rely heavily upon immigrant labor. Most of them, the immigrant labor, are bussed up from Spain. They're housed on the estates, they're fed there. They work in those vineyards during the harvest. And those who represent the elite vineyards would say that it's really important to hand pick the grapes. That way you can discern which bunch of grapes looks good, which doesn't, and can be discarded. There is a woman that I became very friendly with who was a director, a vice president at one of the cooperatives, who used to make fun of the mechanization of the vineyards, because she argued, okay, well, when you have a device that sort of shakes the vines and whatever falls off falls into a conveyor belt, when it vinifies, she said, oh yes, you can have your wine and your escargot at the same time. In other words, being critical of the fact that there can be snails in among the vines that end up sort of in with the grapes that will be vinified by the cooperatives. Festivals, again, are a very important part of what brings attention to the cooperatives in the southwest of France. They are also important in terms of the more elite chateaus. And sometimes they are even paired, in this particular case, with a garlic festival. And these are opportunities for not only French tourists, but American tourists and tourists around the world to come to a village, to taste food. Sometimes they'll serve mussels, cheese, and you can sample wines from a number of the different cooperatives. And it's that potential to connect face to face with some of the growers that really ends up being a rather significant appeal to those who attend such festivals. Even families have their history in terms of generations. Here you see a picture of a family from one of the cooperatives in the Medoc. And the woman to my far right is grandma. And essentially it was she and her husband who owned the vineyards that belonged to the family. Her husband is to my left. And in the center, you find the son. And you'll see that among many small-scale growers, the market for wine has tremendous vicissitude. Some years it's good, some years it's not so good. And often the parents will encourage the young people to go on and find another career. René, who's the son in the middle, decided to go to the University of Bordeaux. He got a degree in business. He went to work with for a company that markets vacuum cleaners. It didn't have any social significance to him. He ended up quitting and coming back to work with his father. And basically, they have worked together to produce some good wines that are bottled at the cooperative under a Chateau label. And they're able to do that because they have their grapes in the entirety vinified together rather than mixed in with the grapes that come from other cooperative growers. They also use University of Bordeaux students for the harvest. They have a lot of fun. They drink a lot of wine. And I can assure you that grandma, who's in her 90s to the right, could drink any college student under the table. So, she's quite a spirited, smart, with it woman. In terms of the people who do most of the work in the vineyards, you can see it's a little bit of a dark slide. My apologies for that. A group of men, often in their 50s and 60s. And many of these men had nothing beyond a 5th or 6th grade education. It's a little bit like certain periods in the United States when young people become literate through the schools. They're needed to work on family farms. And this was usually the outcome of some of these growers. And there were some substantial conflicts between the older growers and the younger ones, because the younger ones were going to the local enological schools. They had a lot of book learning that was really not accessible to men like this. And of course, these men had a kind of humorous way of defending their learning in the fields. And one of the things they would say is that you learn at the feet of the vines, meaning that there's absolutely no substitute for hands-on experience, and hands-on experience that is passed from one generation to the next. This again is a slide that shows the importance of some of the wine festivals. And ordinarily what they do when they prune the vines is they collect them in this way. In the 19th century, before they had gas-fired ovens, they would burn them. And essentially, if you use these vines in an oven in a bakery, they burn very hot. Today, of course, they do have gas-fired ovens, so they dispense of them simply by burning them in this particular fashion. By the way, in terms of speaking about something that is historical, many people think of wine as a natural product. Why? Because it ferments with, some degree of intervention on the part of humans and human knowledge. However, back in the early part of the 20th century, there were wines that were made from many dried fruits other than grapes. So the peasantry would use apricots, pears, and so on. And the French government, in attempting to advance the importance of wine made from naturally fermented grapes, defined wine in specifically that way. So if you were a small-scale farmer and you were making wine from apricots, you couldn't call it wine. So some of the measures that were taken by the government were really important historically in terms of trying to narrow the market and essentially apply advantages to growers that had some considerable means. Just to show you that anthropologists do work, this is the hardest work I ever did. Of course, as many of you probably who enjoy wine know that you can swirl it around, you can smell it, but then you generally spit it out. I always make sure I have this one because people think this is the softest type of work that you can possibly do. This gives you an idea of the pruning of vines. Essentially, I was not allowed to do that kind of work because it requires substantial knowledge, knowing which vines to prune and which not to prune. This gives you an idea of some of the workers out in the vineyards. Usually it's in February, pruning the vines. I use this slide because it's a woman who's in the front, and she's one of the very few wine workers that I came across who was a woman. And there's some humor associated with this because it requires a lot of hand strength to prune the vines. And some engineers came up with the idea that you could use a kind of pneumatically powered pruner, air powered, just like you use to tighten the bolts in terms of a tire you're putting on your car. And it was opposed by the growers, all of whom were predominantly male. Why? Because they were afraid they would be asked to do housework by using a technology that would be time-saving. Whoop, I don't know how that got there, but my apologies for that. So what I've tried to do in this relatively short amount of time, number one, is to disclaim the fact that I am an expert on wine. If you want recommendations for a particular wine, don't ask me. Ask at your local liquor store or wine store. Number two, to emphasize that I'm an anthropologist, and as an anthropologist, I am, of course, interested in drinking wine and enjoying the pleasures of it. But most importantly, I'm interested in the people, such as you see on the slide in front of you, and interested in how it is that certain areas that come to be renowned for the wines that they make. And that's why I point to political factors such as Napoleon's 1855, a call upon growers to have this classification, to the occupation of the southwest of France in the 12th to 15th century. These are important historical factors. If they are overlooked by those who write about wine, then you really miss, I think, part of the full picture and story that needs to be told. Cooperatives, on the other hand, are an important part of the French economy. Today, they still have a subordinate reputation to elite wines. I have come to believe that there is a substantial amount of subjectivity that comes with taste in terms of wines that you prefer or don't prefer. Some people, for example, will never drink Greek wines that are basically flavored with licorice because they can't stand the taste of licorice. On the other hand, those wines are appreciated by a considerable audience. So what I would like to do at this time, since we have just a little bit more than 15 minutes remaining, and I've covered a lot of territory here very selectively, is give you an opportunity to ask questions so that I can respond to them.
Yes, so if you do have questions, you can go ahead and enter them into the chat box. I also want to welcome Lorraine Hams, who is the head of our hospitality and tourism management wine classes, wine and food classes. I'm sorry, not wine and food, wine and spirits. And she's on the webinar as well. So she says she's happy to make recommendations if Dr. Ulin is a little concerned about stepping out into that realm. One question that has come up is you mentioned early on, and then you closed your slide with the very heavily gendered environment that is the wine world in France, or at least was. Do you see that has been changing as women have taken on new roles, or is this still the case? And do you think that there is any opportunity in the future for that to really change?
Well, I think circumstances like that regrettably change very slowly. Keep in mind that it was really never my objective to study comprehensively the elite estates. Essentially, I've always been interested in small-scale wine growers, and as I've mentioned, many of whom their stories, their family histories, and what they've accomplished really still remain at the margins of major books that are written about French wine growing. And in those families, there are here and there examples of women who have, through a process of succession, ended up really having a leading role in the wine growing sector. I can tell you a rather sad story of the woman who made the joke about snails, escargot, and wine at the same time. Has about, she had about 8 hectares of vineyards, which one of the large multinationals came along because they're looking to diversify their investments, and they bought out her vineyards. And one of the reasons she decided to sell is she has a son. Her husband had died a number of years ago from a heart attack. Her father-in-law was still alive and basically too old to be of any help. But the son said, "Mom, I am not going to work for a woman." So rather than joining his mother in terms of a vineyard that is rather substantial, he decided he would drive a tractor on one of the elite estates. So there's a circumstance where even within a particular family, a son decides that he can't work for his mother. Yes, I think as we begin to see more opportunities for women, just as in engineering today, it's still men who predominate, but it's changing and changing slowly in the wine growing sector too. I think as particularly is a shift from apprenticeship in the vineyards to going to a local enological school to learn about the biochemistry of wine, to learn something about the marketing and so on. I think there will be a very strong future for women in the wine growing sector in France. I don't know whether that is the same here in the United States, but certainly in France it's changing very slowly.
And we do have a comment from Bill about how growing grapes teaches. By the way, Bill mentioned earlier that he does actually have some grapevines in his home area. So, but he says that growing grapes teach us a lot about humanity, like why it's good to be pruned occasionally.
You have a sense of humor there, and I would absolutely agree with you. But if you look at that slide that I still have up there, there really is considerable knowledge that goes into knowing which vines to cut and which to leave. It's not something that is necessarily intuitive. It's learned, and I would argue it's learned largely by apprenticeship. And again, being an American anthropologist, there were lots of things they would let me do, but the pruning is something they kept me at a distance.
So another question is there a globalization impact, especially for the small cooperative farm wineries and farms in France? Is it beneficial to them? Has it been harmful both to reputation and their ability to function as a successful business? What has been the impact of that?
Well, globalization has been really important. Many people don't realize that significant vineyards in France have been purchased by multinationals. In fact, when I was living in the area, I would come home and find newspapers stuffed into my mailbox that would be calling for global investors to purchase vineyards. The woman whose story I just told about the hesitant son who decided to drive a tractor, her vineyards were bought by AXA, which is a French-based but global insurance company. And like all savvy investors, they're looking for properties that have been well maintained, and they're looking to diversify investments. So this has been damaging, especially to small vineyards. Why? Because they have tremendous capital. They can pay inflated prices for the vineyards. And what that does is it raises the cost of purchasing vineyards per hectare demonstrably. And so small growers, family-owned growers who are seeking to expand just don't have the capital because the price of land is way too high. Secondly, is that price of land rises exponentially. The taxes that one has to pay on the land likewise raises exponentially, which is really a serious threat for having at least family continuity through the generations. This is all a reflection of the process of globalization.
Terrific. Well, if anyone has any more questions, please feel free to enter them into the chat box. And in the meantime, I'm going to let you know a little bit about what we have upcoming in October. Our very next webinar is on Tuesday, September 24th. It is entitled Crash Bang, Call the Forensic Engineer. We will be joined by Martin Gordon. He is a professor and program director for undergraduate studies in the Department of Manufacturing and Mechanical Engineering Technology at RIT, and he is a 16-year forensic engineer. We will also have Margie Oakes joining us again from the Romy Center. She is going to be going through best practice for constructing surveys and finding out what your customers think. So thank you very much. This is all the time that we do have today. If you do have additional questions, please feel free to email them to us at ritalum@rit.edu, and we will direct your questions to Dr. Ulin. All participants will also be receiving an email from us in about a week with a link to today's webinar recording. Thank you very much, Dr. Ulin, for sharing your knowledge about this very interesting topic. And thank you to all of our audience members for joining us today.